Well, it's very difficult to see. I mean, there are a number of scenarios. Absolutely, it could save Putin because we know that he's struggling, his army's struggling, and the country is struggling. But equally, also, it could lead to his demise. I think, quite frankly, us in the Western world really don't care what happens to Putin. What we care about is what happens in Ukraine, and we want to see peace as soon as possible. The war might go on for a bit longer, but nobody wants to see any more sort of civilians or military people killed than is absolutely necessary. So, the best scenario would be a peace, a ceasefire that's negotiated, and a swap of territory to a position where the people of Ukraine are content with it. And quite frankly, what happens to Putin after that happens, well, that's up for the Russian people. And as long as it doesn't affect the rest of us, I don't suppose anybody will lose too much sleep about what happens to him in the future.
Also, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that he was open to the idea of sending peacekeeping forces to Ukraine during his visit to Ukraine, first visit to Kyiv. From your perspective, also, what kind of peacekeeping mission would be the best option for Ukraine? Also, the Telegraph described 3 scenarios of Western peacekeeping deployment to Ukraine: peacekeeping patrolling the buffer zone, Western troops defending Ukrainian capital, and at least a training mission in the west of Ukraine. What kind of option is better for Ukraine?
Well, that's a really good question. I've written about it myself in the Telegraph as well. And having been a peace enforcer in Bosnia back in the 90s and a peacekeeper in Cyprus in a bit later than that, I have personal experience of doing it. I mean, it can take up an awful lot of soldiers, and especially with a border of over 800 miles between Russia and Ukraine, to cover every single blade of grass would require tens, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I think what you need is a credible force to prevent Russia attacking. And I think the good thing about having British troops, one assumes that the Russians would not attack British troops. The challenge with British troops is that British military is so small now. It's a real wake-up call for the British government to make sure that they invest sufficiently in defence, so that we have a credible defence, so that we can do roles like this. I expect it will be a combination of various things, maybe with a command and control structure based on the British military, but with support from perhaps the French and the Scandinavian militaries to provide quick reaction forces that could act if there's any transgression of the ceasefire. And allied to that, of course, as well, training for the Ukraine military to make sure that they have the capabilities that they will need in the future. So we shall see. I mean, I'm very glad that the UK Prime Minister Starmer has said that British troops would be available for this sort of task. I think British troops are excellent at doing this. And with the French suggesting that they would have troops available, and I would have thought also other European NATO countries would get involved, it's clear that European NATO countries could provide a credible force that would prevent the Russians going any further. And I don't think anybody would suggest that the Ukrainian forces would attack this ceasefire force either. So the key thing is, and I hope that there's a lot of planning going on in Western capitals to make sure that as soon as the agreement is made, this force can get in place as soon as possible and provide a credible deterrence to any further fighting.
Times reported that victory of Ukraine was never President Biden's goal, because White House was confident that Ukraine wasn't been able to do so because it was beyond Ukraine's ability. What is your take on such a political legacy of President Biden and his decisions on Ukraine?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, and when one describes what a victory is, that could be that is a many-faceted area. Whether Biden was talking about Ukraine completely retaking all the land that Russia took from 2014 onwards is difficult to understand. But it's certainly clear that President Biden didn't commit, 100% to Ukraine in order to defeat the Russians. Certainly, the Americans produced an awful lot of military capability, far more than anybody else, and provided a lot of intelligence. But it was clear that was not enough, decisive enough. I think everybody, a military analyst like me, would say that the US military is by far the most powerful military in the world. And if they fully committed to this, the Russians would have been defeated some time ago. But of course, Biden had other competing ideas, and that was not within his rationale. I think the difference with Trump is that he wants things over very quickly, and is not prepared to go into a protracted conflict in Europe between the Russians and Ukrainian military, and sees that in the long run for the US, it would be far better to get it over and done with very quickly. Whereas President Biden rather, didn't see it that way. So, I think we're in now that President Trump is in the White House, there is a feeling, I think, on all sides that actually things are going to move quickly now, and they are going to end as quickly as possible. And with President Trump pulling the strings, driving this forward, one hopes, and it would appear that whatever happens is going to be to the advantage of Ukraine, who, of course, has suffered from the illegal invasion of Russia, and rather than Putin, who perhaps thought maybe 12 months ago that Trump would likely save him, rather than, as we're led to believe now, Trump really wants to run Putin out of Ukraine and get back to a peaceful solution in Europe as soon as possible.
Let's also cover situation in the Middle East. From your perspective, do you feel that a ceasefire in Gaza can bring the war in Ukraine closer to its end? Don't you think that this political victory of the United States could strengthen US position during the negotiations with Vladimir Putin? Because at the same time, Putin has lost his Assad regime, has lost his military presence, military bases in Syria. And second question is, what are your impressions on your last visit to Syria?
Well, certainly on the first area, absolutely. With it looks like a ceasefire that will hopefully hold in Gaza, and also the activities of the Israeli military over the last 6 months, particular, by destroying the Iranian militias, mostly Hezbollah, really that, and the fact that the Hezbollah were keeping the Assad regime in power in Syria, which allowed Russia to have its powerful bases in Syria and its southern flank. When the Iranian militias collapsed, so did Russia, and Putin was humiliated and had to scuttle out of Syria at great speed. So I think we now have a much weakened Iranian regime. There is no Assad regime for Putin to lie on the back of. And that's a whole series of defeats. And, on a military battlefield, momentum is absolutely key. And the momentum is completely against Putin at the moment. Over the last 6 months, he has just failed. So I think what happens in the Middle East has a significant impact, because it's also what the Russian people see. They see that, in effect, the Russians have been defeated in Syria, and that their allies, the Iranians, have been defeated in Gaza and in Lebanon as well. So that is just not a good look. For myself, having spent the last week in Syria, it's a very great delight to me. I have been involved in Syria really for the last 14 years, mainly helping in the areas where Assad was trying to attack into, to help the hospitals and the schools, the infrastructure keep running. Now that Assad is gone, there is a dark cloud lifted off the country, and there is hope, so much hope for the future. And absolutely, now that the Russians have left Syria, and the Russians were hated as much, if not more, than the Assad regime for the dreadful things that they did in Syria, bombing schools and hospitals. Exactly the same activity we've seen the Russians in Ukraine. So having seen what has happened in Syria, what one just hopes that similar will happen in Ukraine. And now those of us who have been involved in Syria are looking to try and help them rebuild. So there is hope. I think when I woke up on the 1st of January this year, things look pretty grim around the world. But in the last few weeks, with the demise of Assad in Syria, the ceasefire in Gaza, and hopefully a ceasefire in Ukraine to come soon, perhaps things are looking a little bit brighter than they did in 2024. And let's hope 2025 delivers everything that the Ukraine people deserve and desire, and creates a peace in the Middle East so that Islamists like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda cannot develop and grow and threaten people around the world. So, yeah, there is a chance that 2025 is going to be a good year, and let's hope it is, and let's pray that it is.
We hope too, Colonel Hamish. Thank you for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. Glory.